The sound of metal being bent jolted me out of bed. The Bigfoot my father had kept locked up for 18 days stood in the middle of the yard, taller than any man I had ever met. My father raised his rifle. The hired hand tightened his grip on the shovel handle. Uncle Warren held the oil lamp in both trembling hands. Bigfoot looked at each of them one by one, slowly, as though it had been waiting for this moment for a long time. When the first shot rang out, it charged. Less than a minute later, the entire yard was silent. Then it raised its head and looked straight at the window where I was standing. Hello everyone, I'm Victor, and you're watching Bigfoot Sasquatch Story. Today's story takes us back to the Willow Creek area of California in 1967, where a family operating a traveling animal exhibition was said to have captured a creature they should never have touched. Our editorial team compiled this story from oral accounts, local records, and Bigfoot research communities. We cannot fully verify whether this was a real event, a memory altered over time, or a modern legend. So listen with an open mind. If you believe the forests of America still conceal things unknown, comment Bigfoot. In 1967, a 15-year-old boy named Merle lived with his family on a remote farm at an isolated camp east of Willow Creek in Humboldt County, California. His father, Clyde, operated a small traveling animal exhibition, taking bears, wolves, bobcats, snakes, and unusual animals to fairs throughout Northern California. During one inspection of a bear trap, Clyde, his hired hand Amos, and his close friend Warren discovered a gigantic creature standing on two legs. Instead of releasing it, Clyde decided to turn the creature into a money-making attraction. During 18 days of captivity, the creature silently observed the humans, tested the cage, and especially remembered Merle, the only person who brought it food and water. When mysterious calls began sounding from the southern ridge, Merle understood that the captive creature was not alone. On the night the cage was broken open, all three men involved in capturing the creature disappeared from Merle's life. He alone was spared. More than half a century later, footprints, destroyed cameras, and a video recorded in 2023 led Merle to believe the creature still lived in the Willow Creek region. His life became a journey to understand why it remembered, why it took revenge, and why it chose to let him live. Before the story begins, comment with the city or state you're watching from, and if you have ever had a strange encounter with Bigfoot or a creature you could not explain, share your story below. And now, the story begins in the fall of 1967. In early October 1967, before the light had reached the slopes east of Willow Creek, Merle got out of bed to help his father care for the animals at the camp. He was only 15, but he was already accustomed to the sound of padlocks striking iron bars, the smell of damp straw and raw meat, and the cold mist lying over the ground. The family exhibition consisted of 2 rows of cages, a livestock barn, a storage shed, and a trailer whose wheels were always breaking down. Inside were Abigail, the black bear, 2 wolf hybrids, a bobcat, several large snakes, and other animals Clyde had bought from dealers around Northern California. They took them to fairs, festivals, and livestock auctions, making money from the curiosity of strangers. That morning, while Merle was checking the bear cage lock, he saw Abigail leave her meat untouched, turn her head toward the forest, and repeatedly sniff the air. The 2 wolves also stopped pacing and pressed themselves into the corner of their cage, as if listening to a sound beyond the range of human hearing. Near the trailer, Clyde lay beneath the vehicle, his hands smeared with grease because the left axle had come loose again. The recent fair season had exhausted him. 2 events had been canceled because of rain. 1 bear had required medical treatment, fuel prices had risen, and the bank had sent a letter reminding him about the loan. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the wooden house, wearing a thick sweater, and suggested that her husband sell some of the animals and apply for work at a lumber mill near Willow Creek. Clyde crawled out, wiped his hands on his pants, and said the animal show was the only work that belonged to him. His voice remained steady, but Merle saw his father avoid looking at the unopened envelopes onto the kitchen table. The boy understood that his mother feared the house might be taken away, and he also understood that his father regarded giving up the animal show as admitting that 10 years of effort had been wasted. The conversation stopped when Warren Pike drove his old pickup into the yard. Warren often helped Clyde repair cages and drove on longer trips. After examining the axle, he mentioned a fair near Eureka and said a special attraction might save the season. Clyde remained silent, but his eyes rested on the faded advertising sign, longer than usual. Amos Rusk, who was shoveling straw nearby, said that the previous night he had heard knocking from the eastern ridge, first from 2 locations, and that it had stopped when he turned on a light. Clyde said it was probably hunters or loggers. He took a rifle from the storage shed, told Warren and Amos to prepare the truck, and said the bear trap in the ravine was 3 days overdue for inspection. As the 3 men left the camp, Abigail continued staring toward the forest, and Merle had the feeling that the animals knew something the humans had not yet noticed. Clyde's old truck left the camp while fog still covered the dirt road east of Willow Creek. Warren sat beside the door while Amos held a shotgun between his knees and looked toward the slopes of the Klamath Mountains. After nearly 3 miles, Clyde stopped beside an abandoned logging road, and the 3 men walked down into the ravine where the bear trap had been set 3 days earlier. The trail was narrow. Exposed roots crossed the ground, and the wet leaves made each step heavier. Warren was the first to notice branches broken at a height above a man's head. The inner wood of several branches was still pale, as though they had been snapped during the night. Clyde said a large bear might have stood up while searching for food, but Warren merely looked at the tree trunks bearing 4 long, parallel scratches and slowed his pace. The deeper they went, the quieter the forest became. The birds fell silent, the squirrels stopped moving in the canopy, and only the breathing of the 3 men and the sound of their boots on decaying leaves remained. When they were about 50 yards from the trap, Amos raised a hand. The chain attached to the trap was stretched tight toward a large boulder. The tree stump used as an anchor leaned to one side, and many roots had been pulled from the earth. The ground around it had been torn into deep furrows, showing that whatever had been trapped was stronger than an ordinary bear. Clyde knelt to inspect the tracks. Long prints were clearly visible in the mud, with broad heels and 5 distinct toes. The spacing showed that the creature had been moving on 2 legs before it was caught. Warren suggested returning to call for more help, but Clyde raised a finger to his lips. From behind the boulder came a heavy rhythm of breathing, slow and steady. The 3 men separated while remaining within sight of one another. When Clyde moved around the edge of the rock, he stopped. A gigantic creature was sitting against the slope, its left leg caught in the steel jaws. Black-brown hair covered its body, matted with mud around the ankle. When it saw the humans, it planted both hands on the ground and rose upright. Its head nearly reached the low branches, its shoulders were broad, its arms hung almost to its knees, and its hands had clearly formed thumbs. Its face carried features of both a human and a great ape, but the yellow eyes were what made Warren lower the barrel of his gun. The creature looked at Clyde, shifted its gaze to Amos, then stopped on Warren. After that, its eyes moved from the guns to the chain, the trap, and the road behind them. Warren said they should open the trap from a distance and withdraw. Amos agreed, but Clyde stared at the creature for a long time and mentioned the fair near Eureka. He said an attraction like this could save the entire animal show, then ordered Warren to return for the bear cage, tranquilizer, cables, and more help. Before leaving, Warren looked back. The creature was still watching him with such concentration that he felt it had just memorized the first man who had wanted to set it free. Warren returned to the ravine 2 hours later, with a low trailer, a bear transport cage, several coils of rope, and 2 men who lived near Willow Creek. Clyde had prepared a tranquilizer dart intended for large livestock, though he had no idea how that dose would affect the creature before them. Warren looked at the needle, then at the left leg caught in the trap, and once again suggested that everyone open the mechanism from a distance and leave the area. Clyde answered that they had brought a truck, a cage, and men all the way out there, and that returning empty-handed would make all the effort meaningless. He assigned each man one end of a rope, looped the lines around trees, and used pulleys to control the creature's body when the trap was released. The moment the steel jaws opened, the creature jerked its leg backward. 3 men lost their balance, 1 rope slipped from Amos's hands, and the trailer moved almost a foot from its position. Clyde fired the tranquilizer dart into its shoulder. The creature turned its head toward the needle embedded in its hair, then shifted its gaze to Clyde with an intensity that sent a chill down Warren's spine. The drug only slowed its movements. It was still strong enough to pull the ropes taut, grasp one of the knots, and use its long fingers to loosen the loop around its wrist. It took the group almost an hour to move it to the cage entrance. Each time they dragged it toward the trailer, the creature tried to twist its body toward the forest, as though it still remembered the exact route by which it had been brought out. At the final effort, Clyde and Amos pushed a wooden pole against its shoulder, while Warren raised the sliding door. The creature entered the cage heavily, but as soon as the door slammed down, it stood upright, looked at each man, and backed into the dark corner. The trip back to the camp was slow because the wheels repeatedly sank into the mud. When the trailer appeared in the yard, Merle ran outside, thinking his father had caught a bear. He stopped when a gigantic hand closed around the iron bars. The creature turned its face toward Merle and kept its eyes on him longer than on the others. Merle saw the matted hair around its ankle, the wound left by the trap, and the dart lodged crookedly in its shoulder. Evelyn stepped out behind her son and demanded that Clyde return it to the forest before dark. Clyde said the family would keep it only a few days to determine its value, then ordered the cage placed behind the livestock barn. Amos welded an extra crossbar in place. Warren wrapped 2 layers of chain around the door, and Clyde personally attached 2 padlocks. When everything was finished, the creature stood in the middle of the cage and looked again at the 3 men who had taken part in its capture. Its gaze rested longest on Clyde before it turned its back. That night, after the camp had grown quiet, Merle heard a faint metallic sound from the barn. He looked through the window and saw the creature tracing the door hinge with the tip of one finger, slowly, like a person examining an object it had never seen before. The next morning, Clyde personally carried a piece of meat to the cage to test the creature's reaction. He opened the sliding tray, threw the food inside, and stood close to the door, still holding the iron rod used to push the feeding pan. The creature retreated into the dark corner, its eyes following every movement. When Clyde pushed the rod through the opening and prodded the meat closer, it seized the end of the bar and jerked, so violently that his shoulder struck the cage. Clyde let go, stepped back, and looked at Merle, who was standing near the livestock barn. He decided to assign the task to his son because the creature seemed less wary when it saw the boy. Evelyn objected immediately, but Clyde said Merle only needed to put food and water into the tray and then move away. The first time Merle approached alone, his legs felt heavier than usual. He carried a bucket of water and several pieces of meat, and he kept his voice steady as he announced that he was about to open the tray. The creature stood motionless at the back of the cage, its head slightly tilted and its eyes fixed on the boy's hands. Merle set everything down, slid the tray inward, and backed away several steps. The creature waited until enough distance separated them before approaching. It lifted the bucket with both hands, raised the rim to its lips, and drank in slow swallows. Then, it set the bucket back in exactly the same place without spilling water onto the floor. Merle had cared for many kinds of animals, but the way the creature held the bucket made him think of a person using a familiar object. When it turned its injured leg toward the door, Merle saw the swollen skin around the ankle and the hair clotted with dried blood. He asked his mother for a bottle of antiseptic and a clean piece of cloth, then placed them in the tray during the next feeding. The creature picked up the bottle, smelled the cap, and studied the cloth for a long time. The next morning, the medicine bottle remained untouched in the corner, but the cloth had been torn into strips and wrapped around its leg. Merle told his father. Clyde merely smiled and said the creature's intelligence would make the crowd willing to pay even more. From that day on, Merle always spoke before opening the tray, maintained the same distance, and avoided standing directly in front of the door. The creature gradually stopped retreating all the way into the corner whenever he appeared. It always looked at Merle's face before taking the food, as though confirming that the person approaching was still him. One afternoon, Merle placed 2 pieces of meat at opposite ends of the tray. The creature watched his hands, waited until he left, then chose the piece closest to the direction he had just walked. That gesture made Merle understand that it was remembering everything. That night, when he returned for the bucket, he saw it standing before the door, touching the upper lock, the lower lock, and the sliding, opening in sequence with its long fingers. Over the following days, Clyde began turning the cage behind the livestock barn into the new center of the entire camp. He stretched a large canvas around 3 sides, painted the words "Willow Creek Wild Man" on an old sign, and called several fairs around Humboldt County. Whenever he spoke about the creature, his voice brightened in a way Merle had not heard for a long time. The debts still lay on the kitchen table, but Clyde said this opportunity could lift the family out of their difficult months. Amos was assigned to weld additional braces onto the cage door. As sparks fell to the ground, he noticed the creature standing directly on the other side, watching the welding torch move over each joint. It observed where the metal melted, where the iron bar was attached to the frame, and how Amos tested the latch when the work was finished. The feeling of being watched made him work more slowly, even though Clyde kept urging him on. Warren arrived in the afternoon with food for the wolves and a troubled expression. He told Merle that people who had lived around Willow Creek for a long time sometimes spoke of creatures that passed through the forest, while rarely allowing humans to see them. According to those stories, they remembered routes, recognized faces, and could watch a camp for days before leaving any sign. Clyde overheard, laughed, and said that 1967 was the age of science, while legends merely helped sell more tickets. Merle did not argue, but he began watching more carefully each time he brought food. By the 5th day, the creature had established a clear routine. It looked at Merle first, approached the door, checked the sliding opening, lifted the water bucket, and only then touched the meat. One morning, Merle brought the food almost an hour earlier than usual. The creature was already standing close to the door, which made him realize that it recognized footsteps, the sound of the storage shed opening, or the daily rhythm inside the house. On the 6th night, after everyone had gone indoors, Merle secretly returned to the cage. In the dim light, the creature pulled at each iron bar with both hands. It applied different amounts of force, paused after every attempt to listen to the sound, and only then moved to the next position. When it reached the door, it inserted one finger into the latch opening, pushed upward, pulled downward, and tested the direction of rotation very slowly. Merle stood outside the canvas, feeling as though he were watching a craftsman examine an unfamiliar structure. He whispered that his father was planning to take it to a fair. The creature turned to look at him, then directed its eyes toward the eastern mountains. Merle went back into the house with a conclusion that kept him awake all night. The creature was not trying to break the cage with brute strength. It was gradually learning how to open the door. Clyde organized the first exhibition at a small fair near Hoopa Valley, where families from the surrounding area brought livestock and produce to trade on the weekend. The cage remained covered by a heavy canvas throughout the journey, and Merle sat at the rear of the truck to watch the creature through a narrow gap. Every time the vehicle turned along the winding road, the creature turned its head in the direction of the movement, as though memorizing every bend, leading away from Willow Creek. When they arrived, Clyde erected a separate tent, hung a sign reading "Klamath Wild Man Captured Alive," and charged an additional admission fee. He asked Merle to remain near the feeding tray because he had noticed that the creature stayed calmer when the boy was present. At first, the crowd gathered out of curiosity. Some believed Clyde had brought a deformed bear, while others thought it was an elaborate publicity stunt. When the canvas was raised, the voices in the tent fell silent at the same moment. The creature stood at the far end of the cage, its shoulders nearly touching the upper crossbars, its long arms hanging beside its body, and its eyes studying the line of people before it. One woman pulled her son backward and left. 3 young men near the entrance laughed, but their laughter faded when the creature stepped up to the bars and looked directly at them. A man wearing a hunting cap drew a handgun from its holster because he believed the cage door looked too weak. At once the creature shifted its gaze from his face to the weapon, studied the hand resting near the trigger, then glanced toward the exit behind the crowd. Merle clearly saw it assess the tent, just as it had assessed the trap in the ravine. A local police officer arrived to check permits and asked Clyde what species he was exhibiting. Clyde said it might be an unclassified primate captured deep in the Klamath Mountains. The officer could find no appropriate regulation, but he required Clyde to erect an additional barrier and keep visitors several steps from the cage. Whenever the noise of the crowd rose, the creature looked toward Merle. Clyde noticed and began introducing the boy as the only person who could approach it. By late afternoon, the cash box contained more money than on any other fair day that season. Clyde paid part of a debt in town and told Warren that the family had finally found a chance to change their lives. Warren did not share his excitement. Before the tent closed, an elderly man who lived near Willow Creek entered, stood watching the creature for a long time, and then turned to Merle. He did not ask what species it was or show surprise. He only said the family should return it to the exact place where it had been caught, because creatures living deep in the mountains rarely lived alone. As he left, he paused beside Warren and quietly said that if one was held captive, the others would follow its calls. During the following week, Clyde's traveling exhibition moved through small towns around Humboldt County, stopping at livestock markets, community festivals, and weekend sales lots. The crowd reacted the same way at every location. Young people pressed forward, some men tried to appear calm, and children often clung tightly to their parents' hands when the creature stepped out of the dark corner of the cage. Merle soon noticed, however, that another group responded in a very different way. Elderly people who had lived for many years around Willow Creek and the Klamath Mountains often stood quietly, studying the creature's hands, ankles, arm length, and low forehead. They rarely asked Clyde how he had captured it. Instead, they wanted to know near which creek the trap had been set, which direction the slope faced, and whether the camp had heard tree knocks. One afternoon, at a market near the road leading to Hoopa Valley, an elderly woman from a local indigenous community stood outside the tent before entering. She looked through the bars at the creature, then turned to Merle and asked whether it made long sequences of sounds at night. Merle said that it sometimes produced low calls separated by pauses, as though waiting for an answer from far away. The woman tightened her grip on the scarf in her hand and said old stories from the region often mentioned creatures that lived in groups, recognized individual people, and always knew when one of their members had been held too long. Clyde heard her and came over, telling her to buy a ticket or leave the tent. She placed money on the table but remained where she was. Then said he was holding a creature that belonged to the forest and not to any animal show. At that moment, the creature turned its face toward her and released a short, low sound. Her expression changed visibly. She asked Clyde how many nights that sound had occurred, but he answered that captive animals often vocalized because of stress. The woman looked at Merle and warned him to return the creature before the forest answered. After that day, Warren began writing down the accounts of elderly people they met. Each person used different words, but many details recurred too often for him to ignore. Knocks echoing between ridges, large footprints near water, towering figures avoiding roads, and the ability to remember faces. Clyde turned the warnings into advertising material, drawing even larger crowds. On the way back to Willow Creek, Merle sat beside the trailer and peered through a gap in the canvas. The creature faced east for the entire journey, its eyes fixed on the darkening mountain ranges, as though somewhere among the deep ravines it had heard a sound that humans still could not detect. After the first exhibitions, Clyde returned to the camp with more money than he had earned in any week of that fair season. He paid part of the loan, bought additional feed for the animals, and placed 2 new padlocks on the table, as proof that everything was moving in the right direction. Evelyn looked at the crossed-out bills, but remained uneasy. She said money did not make the forest around them any safer, and Clyde replied that a few footprints and nighttime noises could not support a family. On the morning of the 10th day, Evelyn discovered that a section of the eastern fence had been pressed down. The weeds lay flattened along a broad path, and the damp ground held several impressions larger than an adult man's foot. Amos knelt and measured them with a shovel handle, then said the tracks had been made by something walking on 2 legs. They approached the barn and then returned toward the forest. Clyde insisted that someone was trying to frighten the family into canceling the next performance. Yet no boot prints appeared around the fence. That afternoon, Amos found a deer lying near the creek behind the camp. Its neck had been violently twisted. Its body was almost intact, and there were no prolonged feeding marks around the carcass. Warren examined the injury and then looked toward the dense trees without offering a conclusion. On the 11th night, the 2 wolf hybrids began pacing in their cage, and then lay flat against the ground at the same moment. Abigail turned her back to the forest and gave a low whine. Merle was carrying water to the creature when he heard 3 dry knocks from one ridge. About 10 seconds later, 2 more sounded from a closer location. The captive creature stood upright, placed both hands on the bars, and tilted its head to listen. A short, low sound came from the cage, deep enough for Merle to feel a slight vibration in his chest. Clyde came outside with the rifle, fired into the air, and shouted that whoever was around the camp should leave. The knocks stopped, but the creature turned and looked at him with the same expression Merle remembered from the morning in the ravine. The next day, they found a fence post pulled from the ground and laid across the driveway. The soil around the hole was fresh, and there were no tire tracks, boot prints, or signs that a rope had dragged it. Warren said something strong enough to do that had placed it there to mark the road or test their response. Clyde dismissed the warning and said people around Willow Creek wanted to sabotage his business. On the evening of the 13th day, Merle went outside to retrieve the empty bucket. At the edge of the light, between 2 fir trees, a tall figure stood motionless and watched the cage. Merle froze, listening, as branches moved in a widening arc and then receded. He realized that whatever was outside had come close enough to observe every person in the camp for several nights. When he raised his flashlight, the figure stepped back into the forest and disappeared. On the morning of the 14th day, Merle noticed that the creature ate the meat he placed in the tray. It drank only a few swallows of water and then returned to the door, where both hands touched the lower latch with slow movements. It no longer tested the upper bars, and the welds along the side no longer received the attention they once had. All of its concentration was fixed on the gap between the latch, the doorframe, and the sliding rail. Merle stood several steps from the cage and watched the creature press upward with its fingertips, pull downward, then pause to listen to the metal. He understood that it had eliminated the parts that were too strong and retained only the weak point worth studying. That afternoon, Amos found a long bone hidden beneath the straw in the corner of the cage. One end had been worn down, and the wooden surface beneath the feeding tray showed many fresh scratches. Clyde took the bone away, threw it into a bin, and said the creature was only trying to amuse itself. Warren bent down to examine the marks and saw that they were tightly concentrated around the frame holding the latch. He told Merle that an animal acting purely on instinct would use force anywhere, while this creature was testing each step like a person who understood that the door had its own structure. After dark, low sounds began coming from the cage. Each sequence lasted several seconds, stopped for an equal interval, and returned in a different rhythm. Warren sat on the porch and used a watch to record the spaces between the calls. After nearly an hour, he realized that the creature remained silent longer after the final sequence, as though waiting for a response from the forest. Clyde heard the observation, but said captive animals often made sounds because of stress. He carried a flashlight to the cage and shone it directly into the creature's face. It sprang upright and struck the door with both hands, making the steel frame shake, the chains slam against the bars, and the wolves on the other side of the barn startle. Clyde stepped back and raised his rifle by reflex. The creature stopped, looked at him, and then turned its head toward the eastern mountains. That sudden control left Warren silent, and Merle understood that what had just happened was not a panic reaction. After Clyde returned to the house, the boy brought water. The creature looked at Merle, touched one finger to the lower latch, and directed its eyes toward the forest. Along the edge of the yard, Amos found several branches broken and laid in the same direction, like markers pointing toward the camp. Warren said they should open the cage before whatever was outside came any closer. Clyde replied that the family only needed to keep the creature a few more days for the fair near Eureka. The 15th night began with a silence so deep that Merle could hear the ticking clock in his room, while outside the creature stood against the cage door and waited. At about 2 in the morning, Merle awoke when a long, low sound vibrated through the wooden wall of the house. He sat upright and listened to the call coming from the cage behind the livestock barn. It was deeper than on previous nights, stretching into a long sequence before stopping abruptly and leaving the entire camp seeming to hold its breath. Merle got out of bed, approached the window, and saw the creature standing against the bars, with its head raised toward the eastern slopes. About 10 seconds later, a similar call answered from far away in the Klamath Mountains. The second sound was lower and longer, moving through the ravines like a heavy vibration. The creature in the cage stood motionless, both hands still gripping the door. Then it responded with 3 short sequences, each separated by an even pause. The call from the forest came again. Merle left his room and entered the hallway, where he saw Clyde already standing at the foot of the stairs with a rifle in his hands. Warren came out of the living room, and Evelyn hurriedly put on a sweater, her face tightening when the third sound arrived. No one needed to ask what the others had heard. For the next several minutes, one call came from the camp, and another answered from the forest. At times, Merle heard a shorter sound from a farther location to the north, making him think there might be more than one creature outside. In the yard, the wolves pressed together against the bottom of their cage. Warren placed the oil lamp on the table, looked at Clyde, and said they had to open the cage that very night. He believed whatever was in the forest had identified the camp's exact location, and that keeping the creature one more day would only put everyone in greater danger. Evelyn agreed and suggested putting Merle in the truck, then pulling the latch with a long rope from behind the barn. Merle said the creature had never attacked him and might run directly toward the forest if released. Clyde remained silent for a long time before saying that opening the cage in darkness could draw everything outside into the yard. Warren said the cage itself was the reason they had come closer, then placed the spare key on the table. Clyde picked it up, put it in his pocket, and promised to make a decision the following morning. His voice was calm, but Warren understood that this was only a delay intended to protect the trip to the fair near Eureka. When the exchange in the forest ended, silence returned too quickly. Everyone stood near the window, listening to the wind move over the barn roof. The creature stepped to the cage door, placed both hands on the lower latch, and looked toward the house. Its gaze rested for a long time on the window of Clyde's room before shifting back toward the forest. Merle saw the long fingers tighten around the metal bar. This time the creature did not try to push it upward or pull it down. It simply held the exact position, calmly, as though it had understood the mechanism and was waiting for one final signal. On the morning of the 16th day, the small family kitchen felt more crowded than usual. Clyde sat at the head of the table with both hands around a cup of cold coffee, while Warren placed the spare key in the middle of the unpaid bills. Evelyn stood near the sink, Merle sat close to the window, and Amos leaned against the wall, avoiding any glance toward the cage. No one regarded the calls from the previous night as random noises anymore. Warren spoke first and proposed taking the trailer back to the ravine that morning, opening the door with a long rope and leaving the area before the creatures in the forest came any closer. Evelyn agreed, saying that the fair money was not worth the family's safety. Merle also pointed out that the creature had never lunged at him when he opened the feeding tray, and that if released in the right direction, it would probably run toward the mountains. Amos remained silent for a long time and then said they should wait for daylight to repair the road, prepare the truck, and reinforce the cage before making a decision. Warren looked at him with disappointment, because everyone understood that Amos was still waiting for the money Clyde had promised after the fair near Eureka. Clyde finally set down his cup, pulled the bills toward him, and said the family needed only 3 more days. He calculated that one crowded weekend could pay off the loan, repair the truck, and save the house. He promised to return the creature to the place where it had been caught after the performance. Warren asked whether, if the money was greater than expected, Clyde would truly open the cage or simply look for another fair. Clyde looked down at the table, straightened the edge of a paper, and said everyone was turning a rare opportunity into a disaster because of a few sounds in the forest. His avoidance made Merle understand that his father's promise was no longer certain. Warren reminded him that the things outside already knew the location of the camp, and that the lower latch had been tested dozens of times every day. Clyde answered that the cage remained intact and that fear was controlling them. For the first time, Merle opposed his father in front of everyone, saying that if the creature escaped or if something else entered the yard, money would no longer matter. Clyde stared at his son for a long time, hurt showing clearly before hardening into anger. He took the key from the table, put it in his coat pocket, and declared that the truck, the cages, and the animal show were his to decide. Warren stood up and said, friendship did not require him to continue doing something wrong. The meeting ended in heavy silence. When Clyde went outside to inspect the cage, he stopped at the lower latch. The metal bar had clearly shifted nearly half an inch from its original position. Clyde called Amos into the yard immediately after discovering the displaced lower latch. The two men removed the auxiliary hinge, braced the door again, and carried a thicker steel plate from the shed to cover the entire locking mechanism. Warren stood near the barn with his arms folded, while Merle watched from behind the fence. Each time Amos removed a bolt or lifted the latch bar from its place, the creature stepped closer inside the cage and clearly watched every layer of metal being opened before its eyes. Clyde told his son not to imagine too much, because no animal, no matter how intelligent, could understand the operation of a steel lock. Merle did not answer. He watched the creature's eyes move from Amos' hands to the new metal plate, then stop at the small opening where the latch would slide into the doorframe. After nearly 2 hours, Clyde added a third chain, hung a new padlock, and tested the entire door with a crowbar. The cage frame shook hard but held. He turned to Warren and said the stories around Willow Creek had made everyone lose their composure. Warren replied only that a stronger cage did not mean the creature understood less. That afternoon, a local reporter came to photograph the camp for an article promoting the fair near Eureka. Clyde raised the canvas, stood beside the cage, and recounted the creature's capture in the ravine as a triumph. When the flash went off for the first time, the creature jerked its shoulder, retreated, and covered its eyes with one arm. By the second flash, it stood still, stared directly at the camera, and watched the reporter's finger each time he prepared to press the shutter. The man asked Clyde whether he was certain the cage was safe enough. Clyde answered that the creature had been confined for more than 2 weeks and had not injured anyone. Before leaving, the reporter mentioned several recent livestock disappearances at farms east of Willow Creek. Clyde laughed and said mountain lions or black bears were more likely responsible. That evening, Merle brought water just after dark. The creature did not touch the bucket at once. It approached the new steel plate, placed 2 fingers against the surface, and knocked 3 times, each tap evenly spaced. The metallic sound traveled through the cage frame and spread across the yard. Merle stood still and looked toward the forest. After a short silence, 3 knocks sounded against a tree on the eastern ridge, exactly matching the rhythm from the cage. Warren stepped off the porch, and Amos stopped in the middle of the yard with a lamp in his hand. Clyde heard it too, but he merely said, "Echoes in the mountains often deceived the ear." Merle watched the creature turn toward the answering sound and understood that reinforcing the cage had given it another tool for communication. What worried him more was that the 3 knocks in the forest were much closer than before. The next morning, Clyde and Amos drove into Willow Creek to confirm the exhibition space at the fair near Eureka, while Warren remained behind to help Evelyn repair the leaking barn roof. When the sound of the engine disappeared down the dirt road, Merle carried 3 objects toward the cage: his father's felt hat, the gloves Amos usually wore when pulling ropes, and the handkerchief Warren always kept in his pocket. He placed them on a plank close enough to the bars for the creature to reach. Warren stood behind him and did not ask what Merle was doing, but his expression showed that he understood what the boy wanted to test. The creature approached slowly, extended a hand between the bars, and picked up each object. It smelled Warren's handkerchief first, held it for several seconds, and set it aside. When it took Amos's gloves, its fingers tightened, and then it threw them to the floor. With Clyde's hat in its hand, it stopped the longest. It turned the brim, looked toward the house, and crushed the soft felt until the shape was distorted. Warren released a slow breath and said the creature was distinguishing individual people rather than merely reacting to human scent. Merle remembered its gaze in the ravine, the times Clyde had pushed food with a pole, and the way Amos had held the ropes when they forced it into the cage. He began to understand that it had stored every detail in its own way. The two moved out of sight and watched through a narrow gap in the livestock barn. Nearly an hour passed. The creature sat quietly and occasionally touched the lower latch without applying force. Then, before anyone in the yard could hear the returning truck, it stood, turned its head toward the road, and moved close to the cage door. Several minutes later, the engine of Clyde's truck finally sounded through the trees. Merle looked at Warren, and Warren gave a slight nod. The creature had recognized the vehicle from a distance at which the humans in the yard still could not hear it. When Clyde got out, it stared directly at him before the truck door had even closed. That afternoon, Warren inspected a steel bar near the top of the cage and found that it had been bent slightly. He believed the creature had deliberately created a visible defect so everyone would focus on repairing the upper section, while the lower latch remained its real target. Merle found that thought more disturbing than any violent blow. If the creature could conceal what it was doing, the cage was safe only in his father's mind. Warren proposed opening the door during the night, but Merle feared the creature might return toward the house before running into the forest. Warren asked what was more dangerous, releasing it while everyone could still prepare an escape route, or waiting until it chose the time itself. Merle had not answered when Clyde crossed the yard. The creature immediately stopped touching the latch and fixed its eyes on him, calm as though it knew exactly who held the key. That afternoon, Warren pulled Merle into the storage shed and spread a long rope across the workbench. He proposed tying it to the door latch, running the other end around the corner of the barn, and pulling from a safe distance after Clyde had gone to sleep. Evelyn would wait in the truck near the dirt road, while Merle carried food, water, and several blankets. If the creature ran toward the eastern forest, they would leave the camp before anything else could enter the yard. The plan sounded simple, but all three understood that one small error could open the door while they were still too close. During the afternoon feeding, Merle brought the water bucket to the cage, set down the food, and pointed toward the mountains. The creature looked at his hand, followed the direction of the gesture, then turned back to the door. Its expression gave Merle the feeling that it understood he was trying to help, though he still did not know what it would do once released. While Merle remained near the cage, Warren checked the edge of the forest for an escape route. On damp ground near the fence, he found two sets of footprints. The larger set was almost the same size as those of the captive creature, while the smaller set still far exceeded an adult human foot. The tracks curved in an arc around the camp, stopped at openings that offered a clear view of the cage, and continued toward the creek. Warren returned with a grave expression and said there was probably more than one creature watching them. As dusk fell, Evelyn hid a bag of clothes and food in the truck. Warren tied the rope to a wooden bar to test the pull, while Merle held the other end behind the barn. They had not finished when Clyde entered the shed. He looked at the rope and the bag near the door and immediately understood. Clyde demanded that Merle explain the plan. The boy tried to keep his voice calm and said they intended to open the cage during the night so the creature could return to the forest before the situation grew worse. Clyde asked who had given him permission to touch the family's property. Merle answered that if the creature escaped or someone was hurt, the responsibility would belong to the man who had kept it captive. The words stunned Clyde. In a burst of anger, he slapped his son, then immediately lowered his hand as his expression shifted from rage to regret. Even so, he took the rope, collected all the keys, and locked Merle in his room. Warren stepped forward to intervene, but Evelyn stopped him because Clyde's rifle was lying on the table. From the window of the locked room, Merle looked toward the forest edge. A tall figure moved among the trees and stopped at the exact place from which it could see the cage. Farther behind it, a shorter figure crossed an opening and disappeared. The darkness between the trees seemed to be closing in. Merle understood that the rescue plan had failed, while the creatures outside continued to wait. On the evening of the 17th day, after a tense meal, Clyde carried an oil lamp outside to inspect the cage as usual. He walked around the steel frame, tugged each chain, and then suddenly stopped in front of the door. The additional padlock attached to the outermost loop of chain was gone, even though the chain remained in place and none of its links had been cut or broken. Clyde called Warren and Amos into the yard, his voice immediately becoming suspicious. He accused Warren of taking the lock for the plan to release the creature, but Warren emptied his pockets, placing his knife, lighter, and truck keys on a wooden crate, and told Clyde to search him. Amos shone the lamp over the ground, turned over layers of straw, and looked beneath the trailer but found nothing. Merle's room was unlocked so he could answer questions. He said he had never touched that padlock, and Clyde had already confiscated the rope from the afternoon plan. The argument continued until a faint metallic sound came from inside the cage. Every face turned toward the dark corner. The padlock lay on the floor beside the creature's foot. What confused Warren was that it was still locked, its steel body intact and showing no sign of being smashed. Clyde pushed a long pole between the bars to drag it out. Before the end of the pole reached it, the creature placed a foot on the lock and looked directly at him. It bent down, lifted the object between two fingers, and slowly turned it in its palm. Each time the lock changed position, the lamplight reflected from its steel edges, allowing Merle to see how carefully the creature examined the outer construction. Then it turned the bottom toward the three men, touched the keyhole with the tip of one finger, and held that position for several seconds. The gesture left the entire yard silent. None of them still believed the cage was secure. The creature did not need to use force to prove anything. Choosing the correct location was enough to make everyone understand that the object before it was no longer unfamiliar. It dropped the padlock, stepped backward, and continued watching Clyde. Warren said very quietly that it knew what the lock was for. Amos immediately urged everyone to leave the camp before dawn, because a cage was safe only while the creature inside did not understand how humans closed the door. Clyde tried to say that the lock had slipped through a gap while the trailer was moving, but even he knew the explanation made no sense. Merle looked at the space between the bars, at the undamaged chains, and understood something more frightening than its ability to remove a lock. The creature could move the object without destroying it, yet it had remained inside the cage. It had not escaped because the moment of its choosing had not arrived. When a knock sounded from the eastern forest, the creature turned toward it, and Merle understood that it might be waiting for one final signal from those who had reached the camp. On the morning of the 18th day, Clyde decided to take the creature to the fair earlier than planned, hoping to leave the camp before the signs from the forest became impossible to control. Amos checked the wheels, Warren retied the canvas, and Merle stood near the barn watching the creature observe each person preparing to depart. When the truck and trailer reached the narrow road leading toward Willow Creek, a large fir tree lay across the way. The trunk had not been uprooted as it would be in a storm, nor did it bear saw marks. The wood had been snapped at a height of nearly 4 feet, and the fresh fibers were still pale beneath the dark bark. Warren got out, examined the smaller branches that had been cleared to one side, and said whatever had brought down the tree had made a path for itself, while deliberately leaving the heavy trunk to block the vehicle. Clyde rejected the idea and said local people were sabotaging the business after hearing about the creature. He wrapped a chain around the trunk and attached the other end to the truck. Amos stood behind and signaled, while Warren warned Clyde to pull slowly, because the edge of the road bordered a steep drop. The engine roared, the tires slipped on the damp ground, but the trunk moved only a few inches. The chain tightened and snapped, whipping against the truck bed. The vehicle slid sideways, its rear wheel nearly reaching the edge, before Clyde managed to brake. Inside the trailer, the creature remained facing the forest and released a short, low sound that made the wolves in the vehicle behind it whine. Warren said they should return to the camp and open the cage because the road had been blocked to keep the trailer from leaving. Clyde blamed the old equipment and ordered Amos to get a saw and tools from the shed. When the vehicles returned, Evelyn came out of the house. She said the telephone had been dead all morning. Merle checked the line behind the kitchen and discovered it had been pulled away from the low pole. The wire had not broken from age and had not been cut with pliers. It had been wrapped twice around a tree branch and pulled taut toward the forest. Warren examined the ground beneath the pole and found a large footprint pressed deeply into the soil beside the fence. Clyde still tried to blame wind or an animal caught in the wire, but even he could not explain why the branch was higher than a man's head. Amos announced that he would leave on foot if the road was not cleared before dark. Clyde replied that no one was leaving while the work remained unfinished. The tension between them made Merle realize that the camp had changed. The cages still stood in place, but now the road was blocked, the telephone was silent, and the forest surrounded them like walls. When he returned to his room, he saw a large footprint directly beneath the window, its toes pointing toward the house. The footprint beneath the window made Merle understand that whatever was outside had come close to the house. But what worried him more was the way the men in the camp had begun looking at one another. Amos packed his clothes into a canvas bag and declared that he would walk to the main road before dark. Warren stopped him beside the shed and said several creatures were watching the forest, and that a person traveling alone would be an easy target. Amos answered that staying beside the cage was more dangerous, especially while Clyde still viewed the creature as property that could sell tickets. Clyde heard them, came over, and ordered Amos to return to repairing the road. The argument grew heated. Amos reminded Clyde that he was the one who had set the trap, prepared the tranquilizer, and ordered the creature dragged out of the ravine. Clyde answered that Amos had held the ropes, accepted payment, and participated, willingly from the beginning. Warren stood between them and admitted that he also shared the blame. He said late regret did not erase the fact that he had helped lock that door, but they still had a chance to correct the wrong before more people disappeared. His words silenced the yard for a moment, long enough for everyone to recognize that their friendship had fractured. Evelyn used the opportunity to bring a bag of food, water, coats, and flashlights to Merle's room. She told her son to keep his shoes beside the bed, because if the situation changed, the two of them would have to leave the camp immediately. In the yard, Clyde opened a bottle of liquor he rarely touched during the day, took a drink, and set the rifle on a wooden crate near the door. He checked each cartridge, cleaned the barrel, and stared toward the forest, as though trying to turn everything into a confrontation that weapons could solve. Inside the cage, the creature began pacing whenever Clyde raised his voice. Its heavy steps shifted the straw, but when Merle appeared on the porch, it stopped and looked at him. Amos noticed and quietly said the creature knew exactly how each person had treated it. Clyde heard, but did not respond. Amos agreed to remain until morning on the condition that he keep the shotgun. Clyde handed it over, but gave him only a few shells, making Amos understand that trust between them had nearly vanished. Warren pulled the oil lamp closer and told everyone to keep away from the cage and not to fire unless they were actually attacked. Before anyone could answer, a low call sounded from the eastern forest, close enough to make the window glass vibrate slightly. The creature in the cage stopped pacing and raised its head to listen, while all three men turned toward the darkness, each holding a different weapon and a different fear. When the call from the forest faded, Warren decided not to wait any longer. He pulled Evelyn and Merle into the shed and said the western trail might still lead them to the main road if they left before full darkness. Evelyn put the bag over her shoulder, handed Merle a flashlight, and told him to walk between them at all times. They left the camp through a small gate behind the barn, moving quietly so Clyde would not notice. At first, the trail held only the sound of dry leaves beneath their shoes and wind sliding through the fir branches. After about 10 minutes, Merle heard heavy footsteps moving parallel to them along the slope. Whenever the three stopped, the sound stopped as well. When they continued, the slow steps resumed among the trees, always maintaining the same distance. Warren raised the lamp, but the light touched only wet trunks and ferns as high as their waist. At an open section of trail, Merle saw a tall figure pass between two fir trees. It did not approach, it merely changed position and continued watching. Evelyn tightened her grip on her son's hand, and Warren lowered his gun because he understood that any shot could turn observation into confrontation. They went nearly another half-mile and reached a narrow cut where the path ran beside a rock wall. Warren had just crossed when a large boulder rolled down from the upper slope, struck the ground directly in front of Evelyn, and completely blocked the way. Branches snapped above them, followed by several footsteps withdrawing deeper into the forest. Warren studied the slope and the boulder's position and realized it could only have fallen at that exact moment if something had been watching every step they took. He proposed returning, because climbing the wall in darkness would be more dangerous than remaining at the camp. On the way back, Merle discovered 2 rows of footprints in soft mud. One set was enormous. The other was smaller, but still longer than an adult human foot. They ran parallel, stopped at openings overlooking the trail, and continued circling toward the camp. Merle began to think the creatures were not hunting them. They were controlling their direction and forcing everyone back toward the cage. When the three emerged into the yard, Clyde was waiting with the rifle in his hands. He became furious and accused Warren of inventing stories to force the family to release the creature. Warren pointed to the mud on his boots and said the western route had also been blocked. Clyde still did not believe him, but his gaze wavered when he saw Evelyn holding Merle's shoulders tightly. Twilight settled over the camp, and inside the cage the creature stepped to the door, placed both hands on the lower latch, and began to pull. The metal trembled beneath its grip, signaling that the camp's time for delay was ending. Warren placed the spare key on the kitchen table as soon as everyone returned to the house. He said they still had one final chance to prevent disaster. Tie a rope to the door latch, put everyone in the truck, and open the cage from behind the barn. Evelyn agreed, and Amos stood still for several seconds before nodding. Merle said the creature had had many opportunities to harm him, but had always maintained its distance, so the most likely outcome was that it would run toward the forest once the door opened. Clyde looked at the key, the fare confirmation papers, and the bills he had just paid. He said opening the cage now would make every debt payment, every effort, and the entire fair season meaningless. Warren stepped forward to take the key, but Clyde placed a hand on the rifle beside his chair and ordered him to step back. The gesture plunged the kitchen into silence. Evelyn pulled Merle upstairs, took him into his room, and told him to stay near the window, keep his shoes beside the bed, and under no circumstances run into the yard when he heard noises. Then she returned downstairs because she understood that leaving Clyde alone in that state would be even more dangerous. Outside, the creature suddenly stopped pulling at the latch. It retreated into the corner of the cage, sat down, and remained in the same position for hours. The calls in the forest also disappeared. allowing the camp to sink into a false calm. Near 11 o'clock, Clyde began to believe the danger had passed. He divided the watch among himself, Warren and Amos, each standing near the cage for a short period. Merle lay in bed with his eyes open, listening to boots crossing the yard, wind brushing the barn roof, and tiny metallic impacts. The sounds always came from the same location and stopped whenever the guard turned around. Warren noticed the pattern, but Clyde said the gauge frame was contracting in the cold. Near midnight, Amos left his position to get more lamp oil from the barn. Warren went around the back to check the wolves, which had begun whining. Clyde stood alone before the cage door, his rifle resting beside his foot. As he bent to adjust the lamp wick, a long scraping sound came from the lower latch. Clyde raised his head, but the creature had already stepped back and was standing still. He moved close to the bars, shone the lamp inside, then turned away for several seconds to call Amos. The metal sounded again, this time deeper and accompanied by a vibration running along the doorframe. Upstairs, Merle sat upright. He pressed his ear to the window and realized the creature acted only when the guard's eyes left it. In the yard below, Clyde still did not understand that the silence of the past several hours was part of a plan. Just as Amos returned with the oil can, a dry crack came from the lower weld, signaling that the door had begun to leave the position that had held it for 18 long days. The instant the crack beneath the weld ended, Clyde seized the lamp and stepped close to the door. The creature stood inside with both hands gripping the lower latch, its body leaning slightly forward as though it had waited for the exact moment when everyone was separated. Amos set down the oil can and raised the shotgun, while Warren ran back from the barn and ordered Clyde to move away. A long metallic groan sounded as the creature twisted the entire latch out of its retaining slot. The reinforcing plate bent, the chain slid across the edge of the door, and the cage frame shook so violently that dust fell from the barn roof. Merle rushed to the upstairs window and looked down through the unsteady yellow lamplight. Clyde shouted for Amos to find a crowbar, but the creature had already pressed one shoulder into the narrow opening between the door and frame. It forced once more, and the door sprang out of its track and tilted sideways. The chains fell heavily onto the ground. The creature stepped from the cage and stood upright in the middle of the camp. After 18 days confined by steel bars, its true height made all three men retreat. Its shoulders were broader than Merle had imagined, its arms hung nearly to its knees, and black-brown hair covered its entire body, still matted around the ankle bearing the mark of the trap. The creature turned its head toward the house, and its eyes stopped at the window where Merle stood. They looked at each other for several seconds. Merle saw no obvious rage in its face, but he felt a recognition that made the hand gripping the curtain turn cold. A low call sounded from the eastern forest, closer than ever before. The creature immediately turned toward it, lowered its body, and began running on all four limbs. It crossed the yard, passed over the section of fence that had pressed down, and disappeared among the fir trees. Clyde reacted before anyone else. He grabbed the .30-30 rifle and said that if the creature escaped deep into the mountains, every debt payment, every effort, and the family's opportunity would be lost. Warren seized his shoulder and told him to stop and wait for daylight. Clyde threw off his friend's hand, ran across the yard, and entered the forest. Amos looked at the shotgun in his hands, hesitated for one beat, and followed because he feared Clyde alone would fire recklessly or come to harm. Warren remained for several seconds, looked back toward the house, and understood that the other two would not stop. He picked up the oil lamp, shouted for them to wait, and ran after them, hoping he could still prevent another mistake. Merle watched the three figures vanish among the trees, with the creature's heavy steps ahead of them and boots slipping over damp earth behind. About a minute later, a gunshot sounded from deep in the Klamath Mountains. A second followed soon after. Then the entire forest fell into a suffocating silence. After the second shot, Merle remained at the window, unable to take his eyes from the darkness, into which his father, Warren, and Amos had disappeared. Evelyn ran upstairs, pulled him back from the glass, and held both of his shoulders, as though assuring herself that he was still there. In the yard below, the cage door lay tilted on the ground, chains stretched across the mud, and the animals in the rows of cages began moving with an uneasy rhythm. 1 minute passed, then 5. No oil lamp returned among the trees, and no human voice called from the trail. Deep in the forest, a large branch broke, with a sound so heavy that Merle imagined a whole trunk snapping. Immediately afterward came chaotic footsteps slipping down a slope, sometimes near and sometimes distant, and then they stopped completely. Evelyn wanted to run outside, but the remaining animal handler at the camp stopped her at the foot of the stairs. He said they did not know what was in the forest or what the 2 shots had been fired at. Merle watched the clock on the wall. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Each time the second hand completed a circle, he waited for his father to call his name. The camp remained silent. The wolves pressed flat against the bottom of their cage, occasionally giving a low whine. Abigail turned her back to the house, her muzzle pointed toward the darkness, as though listening to movement too distant for human ears. After half an hour, Evelyn put on a coat, picked up a lamp, and said she had to search for her husband. The handler held the door and reminded her that Merle and the others still needed protection. She stood there for a long time, her hand tightening around the lamp handle until her knuckles turned white, then was forced to step back. An hour passed. Wind from the Klamath Mountains carried the smell of damp earth and tree resin, but no human footsteps. Near dawn, a long call sounded from the east, drifted across several ridges, and faded into the distance. Nothing at the camp answered. Merle found that more frightening than the gunshots, because the creature had returned to where it belonged while the 3 men remained somewhere out of sight. As the sky began to pale, several neighbors were awakened, and a small group prepared lamps, rope, and hunting rifles. Evelyn insisted on going, and Merle stayed close behind despite being told to remain at the camp. At the forest edge, they found gigantic footprints pressed deeply into the damp ground. Beside them were 3 sets of bootprints belonging to Clyde Warren and Amos, all heading into the Klamath Mountains. Not one track returned toward the camp. Merle knelt and touched the print of his father's boot. The heel remained sharply defined because the soil had not yet collapsed. He understood that they had passed there only a short time before, and that the search had to begin immediately. The search party entered the forest as the first light filtered through the fir canopy. Warren had left a broken oil lamp somewhere ahead, while Clyde and Amos carried guns, so everyone called their names, hoping an answer would return from the slope. Merle stayed close to his mother, comparing the 3 sets of bootprints with the large tracks pressed deeply into the damp soil. In some places they ran parallel. In others, the bootprints overlapped the edges of the gigantic tracks, showing that the 3 men had followed the creature for a long distance. Branches, broken above human height, ferns crushed to the ground, and mud splashed onto tree trunks, showed that the pursuit had moved faster than they imagined. Near a stream, the lead searcher found Warren's oil lamp shattered between 2 rocks. Oil still spread over the surface of the water, and the metal handle was bent as though it had fallen while he was running. Evelyn called her husband's name again, but only water moving over stones answered. Amos's boot prints slid a long way down the bank and reappeared on the other side. Clyde's continued straight toward a narrow ravine, while Warren's curved around a thicket as though he had tried to avoid an obstacle. Several yards farther, someone picked up a .30 to .30 shell casing beside a tree trunk bearing a fresh impact mark that remained clear in the bark. Farther on, they found a shotgun shell from Amos' weapon. There was no blood, clothing, or drag mark around either location. Every theory became more difficult to understand. If they had shot the creature, no sign showed that it had been wounded. If they had fired in self-defense, the ground did not preserve clear evidence of a struggle. Beyond the stream, the tracks became chaotic. The large footprints circled an area of rocky ground, while the 3 sets of boot prints overlapped, changed direction several times, and then all led up a slope. Merle knelt to study the heel of his father's boot and saw that Clyde had still been running when he passed there. The group continued to a broad stone shelf where mud and decaying leaves disappeared. Every human track ended at the edge of the rock. Searchers spread out in both directions and examined cracks, brush, and ways down the slope, but found no continuation. Tracking dogs arrived late in the morning. They followed the scent to the edge of a deep ravine, then stopped, lowered their tails, and pulled their handlers backward. A ranger circled downstream and called everyone to the opposite bank. In the mud beside the water, several gigantic footprints continued deeper into the forest. No boot prints appeared beside them. Merle stood looking at the distance between the banks and understood that somewhere between the stone shelf and the stream, his father, Warren, and Amos had disappeared from every trail humans could follow. In the days that followed, the search expanded into many ravines, stream beds, abandoned logging roads, and slopes around Willow Creek. Local residents brought ropes, lamps, tracking dogs, and maps, while rangers divided the area into grids to avoid missing any section. Helicopters were called in when the weather allowed, but the thick canopy let observers see only stretches of green extending to the Klamath Mountains. Search teams inspected rock hollows, abandoned camps, creek banks, and places where a person might fall without being found. Every afternoon, Evelyn stood beside the wooden table at the camp, waiting for someone to return with a coat, a gun, or any object belonging to Clyde. No one brought back anything. After a week, police began discussing the possibility that the 3 men had become lost, fallen into a deep ravine, or been swept through an underground water channel. Others suggested they might have left the area for personal reasons, but that theory enraged Evelyn because the vehicles, money, clothing, and families of all 3 remained behind. Merle described the cage being opened from the inside, the 2 gunshots, and the large tracks leading into the forest. The officer took notes and then said a boy who had just suffered a shock might mistake a bear standing on 2 legs. Merle pointed to the bent steel latch, the intact padlock, and the 5-toed footprints that many people had seen. Those details entered the initial file, but when the public report appeared, most of it had been reduced to 3 men missing in dangerous mountain terrain. Local newspapers showed interest in the Bigfoot story for several days, then shifted the focus to accidents, disorientation, and weather. Some articles called Merle's account the imagination of a frightened teenager. Each time he read them, he remembered the creature's eyes looking across the yard before it ran toward the mountains. The large-scale search continued for several weeks and then gradually narrowed. No bodies, guns, clothing, or fresh evidence were found. Clyde, Warren, and Amos were officially listed as missing because there was no proof that they had died. The traveling animal exhibition collapsed soon afterward. The remaining animals were moved elsewhere. The canvas sheets were taken down, and the camp that had once been full of noise became empty. Before Evelyn took Merle away from Willow Creek, he made one final circuit of the eastern fence. On a tree near the forest edge, 4 fresh scratches ran straight down the bark. The inner wood was still pale and clean. Merle stood looking at them for a long time, understanding that the 3 men had vanished, but whatever they had pursued might still be somewhere among those mountain slopes, still alive. After the exhibition collapsed, Evelyn took Merle away from Willow Creek and tried to build a life for her son far from the eastern forests. For many years, Merle avoided speaking about the night his father disappeared. He learned a trade, raised a family, and returned to Humboldt County only in 1978, when he was old enough to decide for himself what needed to be investigated. The old camp had nearly been swallowed by vegetation, but the trails leading toward the ravines remained. Merle began walking along the streams and recording every large footprint that appeared after rain. They had clear heels, 5 toes, long strides, and often stopped at stone or vanished in running water. He did not hurry to tell the press, because the memory of how people had looked at a terrified teenager remained sharp. Instead, he bought notebooks and marked the date, weather, direction of travel, and location of every track on topographic maps. Over many years, the points gradually formed a broad area across several ridges east of Willow Creek. He found tree trunks with 4 deep scratches above human reach, deer carcasses with severe neck injuries, and many branches broken in the same direction. On autumn nights, Merle sometimes heard sequences of low calls crossing the forest, beginning on one ridge and answered from another. Each time, he remembered the 15th night beside the cage. In 2006, Merle began placing trail cameras along routes he believed the creatures frequently used. The first devices repeatedly disappeared. Some were pulled from trees, some were turned to face the trunk, and others left only straps and broken pieces of plastic beneath the leaves. Merle changed locations, concealed his scent, placed cameras inside dead trees, and raised them higher above the ground. Over the years, he collected more than 30 recordings, most showing only darkness, a blurred movement, or a figure standing behind a tree for a few seconds. Although none was clear enough to convince skeptics, the way the cameras were discovered made him believe that whatever he was following understood the presence of humans. In 2023, a device placed deep in the forest captured a clearer image than any before it. From a distance of nearly 60 yards, a tall figure walked on 2 legs through an opening between fir trunks and disappeared beyond the slope. Merle watched the video many times. The arm length, shoulders, low-set head, and rhythm of its steps brought the memory of 1967 back intact. He could not say it was the same individual, and he did not know how long such a creature might live, or whether several generations inhabited the region. Yet, for the first time in more than half a century, Merle felt he was looking at part of the answer. That feeling made him decide to return to the place where the old trap had once been set. In the fall of 2024, when he was already in his 70s, Merle returned to the ravine where his father had set the trap in 1967. The old logging road had nearly disappeared beneath ferns, roots, and fallen firs, forcing him to rely on maps and memories that had followed him for more than half a century. He carried a camera, water, and a gun inside his backpack, but kept both hands empty. When he arrived, Merle recognized that the boulder against which the creature had once sat was still there, though moss covered its surface. Beneath decaying leaves, he found several rusted fragments of the trap. They were so small that it was difficult to believe they had once changed so many lives. Merle placed them near their original location and stood still, listening to water moving beneath the rocks and wind passing through the canopy. Behind the place where the trap had been anchored stood a large tree. 4 fresh scratches marked the dark bark, deep, straight, and higher than his head. The wood inside was still pale, the edges clean, and not yet darkened by rain. Merle stepped closer, but did not reach out to touch them. He considered many possibilities: a territorial mark, a warning, a way of marking a route, or the action of a creature that had simply passed by. Whatever explanation was most reasonable, the location of the 4 scratches was difficult to ignore. They were directly above the place where his father had once set the trap. Merle remembered the night the cage opened, the creature's shape running toward the forest, and the 3 men choosing to follow it. He still did not know whether Clyde, Warren and Amos had suffered an accident, become lost, or entered a place from which they could not return. He knew only that the creature had been able to move toward the house, but had chosen to leave the camp. For years, Merle had believed that finding enough evidence would help him understand that night. Now, standing before the tree, he realized that understanding did not necessarily require pursuit, capture, or proving everything to other people. From the eastern slope, a low call sounded. Merle stopped, held his position, and listened as it traveled through the ravine. After a pause, a second call came from farther away, lower and shorter. Its structure matched what he had heard when he was 15. Merle did not answer. He did not place a new camera, follow the sound, or take the gun from his backpack. He turned back before dark, leaving the pieces of iron and the 4 scratches behind. More than half a century earlier, his father had followed the creature into the forest and never returned. Merle chose to stop at the boundary. Because sometimes survival does not come from learning more, but from understanding when a human being should turn back.